when almost everything that could go wrong did. This is the story of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, mainly as Fire Marshal Robert A. Williams watched it unfold.
Most of us thought we had learned just about everything we needed to know about the Great Chicago Fire by the time the 150th anniversary of the city's greatest disaster was commemorated in 2021. What hardly anyone had been aware of at that time, however, was the perspective of Chicago's chief fire marshal, who led the fight to subdue the conflagration. That is what this presentation aims to reveal. A strategic location at the mouth of the river that links it to Lake Michigan made Chicago a natural crossroads for trade. The introduction of railroad operations in 1848 all but assured that the city would become a boom town in the decades ahead. From fewer than 4,500 inhabitants 3 years after Chicago's incorporation as a city in 1837, almost 30,000 were counted as residents by 1850. By the time Abraham Lincoln became a presidential nominee in the city's Wigwam Convention Hall in 1860, the population had reached 112,000. The Civil War made Chicago, already bustling with commercial activity, a major supplier and transporter of equipment and manpower for the Union Army in campaigns to the South. By 1870, with life returning to peaceful pursuits, growth brought about by the war had multiplied the population more than 2.5 times to some 300,000 souls. That year, the Chicago Sanitary Department reported that of almost 50,000 buildings in the city, only 1/10 were of brick, stone, or iron construction. Even that was misleading because from early on, almost every structure was built primarily of wood. Wood was also used for sidewalks, since so much of Chicago's central core rested on mud. Hazards posed by the widespread use and storage of wood, and sometimes lengthy periods of dry weather, made clear the need for some organized means of extinguishing fires that would often break out. Chicago's first fire company, called the Washington Volunteers, was formed in 1832. The first fire-related ordinance, approved the following year, prohibited the passing of any stovepipe through the roof, partition, or siding of any building unless guarded by tin or iron 6 inches from the wood. Another ordinance established a corps of wardens and assistant wardens in each of 4 wards Chicago had been divided into. The chief warden was authorized to command firefighting efforts in his ward, which could include requiring bystanders to help extinguish a fire and fine them $5 if they refused to do so. With the threat of fire ever present, as new homes, commercial, and industrial buildings sprang up, the development of firefighting methods and services had difficulty keeping pace and never seemed adequate to meet the needs of the times. An 1835 ordinance, for example, required a dwelling occupant or store owner to provide a leather water bucket for every fireplace or stove in their home or workplace. These individuals were expected to rush to the scene of a fire in their neighborhood with their fire bucket and follow the orders of the local warden on how to proceed from there. By March 4th, 1837, when Chicago was incorporated as a city, there were 6 wards and the population had reached 4,170. As the city grew, a volunteer force using manually operated apparatus was established. Among those who served as a volunteer was Dennis J. Sweeney, who joined in 1845. As chief of the department 10 years later, he pushed for the purchase of a steam-powered engine that could provide the water pressure needed to fight fires effectively as the city grew along with the height of many new buildings. Another volunteer fireman, 20-year-old Canadian-born Robert A. Williams, arrived in Chicago in 1848 and stayed on when the fire department became professionalized 10 years later. Becoming its chief in 1868, it was under Williams' leadership as Fire Marshal of Chicago that the Great Chicago Fire was fought in 1871 amidst the most challenging conditions ever faced by those who chose to join the fire service. Among other situations that made the job so challenging was that the city grew all too quickly, with many industrial facilities creating or storing materials that were highly combustible. Regardless of how impressive their outward appearance might have been, building interiors consisted mainly of wood, and the weather along Lake Michigan produced winds that could spread fires quickly. Information about Robert Williams and how he led the fight to save the city during the fire of 1871 was compiled by Frank McMenamin, a former Chicago firefighter and a founding member of the Fire Museum of Greater Chicago. It was through McMenamin's lengthy research of material on Williams and documents, including the findings of an official investigation of the fire, that this presentation was based. It took two disastrous fires in the late 1850s to convince Chicago civic leaders that volunteer firemen and the way they operated, sometimes in competition with each other, could no longer provide reliable fire protection. A more disciplined, professional firefighting force was required, and apparatus more effective than what volunteers were using was needed. When John Wentworth became mayor in 1857, a steam pumper was purchased from a manufacturer in Upper New York. Nicknamed Long John for the mayor and his 6-foot 6-inch frame, the horse-drawn engine went into service the following year with a paid engineer and assistant engineer to operate it. That innovation assured the demise of the volunteer firefighters who counted on their runs with manually operated apparatus to show that their service was relevant. The City Council made the entire fire service a professional force through an ordinance passed on August 2, 1858. The Board of Control that was established to govern the department was also given authority to purchase additional equipment, build firehouses, and improve both the water and fire alarm systems. The 15-engine and 3 hook and ladder companies, previously manned by volunteers, became part of a professional Chicago fire department led by Uriah P. Harris, who was the first chief fire marshal. A fire alarm system, which included 120 miles of overhead wires that connected to 116 signal box alarms, had already been completed in 1865. The alarm boxes were locked, and a key to each box was held by the owner or resident of a nearby building whose location was posted on the box. Every policeman and fireman also had a key. The 1870s began with great promise for Chicago, the Civil War having brought about enormous growth of new and old industries alike. Reflecting his confidence in the city's future, businessman Potter Palmer, who had made a fortune in real estate and as a dry goods merchant, bought up property on State Street and had it widened to make it the major shopping street in the city. He also surprised his peers by marrying 21-year-old socialite Bertha Honore. October of 1871 was to be the first month of operation for his new hotel on State Street, which was regarded as a wedding gift for his bride. Along with thousands of others, however, Palmer's good fortune unexpectedly took a big hit. Fire Marshal Williams was among many who had growing concerns about the oppressive drought Chicago was experiencing that year, noting there had been virtually no rain from early July through the 1st of October. He had good reason to worry. It was apparent that expansion of the fire department had not kept up with Chicago's growth. The city limits then extended from Fullerton on the north to 39th Street south. The western boundary varied from western south to North Avenue, then west to 40th Avenue, which became Crawford in 1913 and Pulaski in 1933. From there, it ran south to 31st Street, east to Western, south to 39th, and east back to the lake. Fire protection for that entire area was provided by 16 engine companies and 1 engine in reserve, 6 hose companies, 4 hook and ladder companies, and 2 hose elevators, which a veteran fireman might call early water towers. All this apparatus was manned by 219 firemen who worked 6 days a week and had just 1 day off. Considering how dry the summer of 1871 had been, a major fire in Chicago seemed all but inevitable. The threat was due not just to the fierce winds and dry conditions around the base of Lake Michigan, but also because wood was so heavily used in construction. Lumber yards and wood-based industries could be found almost everywhere along the Chicago River. There, wood would be stacked until builders came to haul it to construction sites or send it by rail or ship to where it was needed. At the beginning of October 1871, a fire insurance patrol was organized by insurance companies to help save property, particularly on the lower floors of buildings when fires were being fought on floors above. Patrol wagons would carry tarpaulins that could be stretched over property to keep it from being damaged by water flowing down upon it. Several costly fires broke out in that first week of October, which taxed the energy of the firemen called upon to extinguish them and the effectiveness of the apparatus that was in almost constant use. A rehearsal of sorts for what was to come occurred Saturday, October 7th, just blocks away from the conflagration that would break out only hours later. Chief Williams reported that while wrapping up a fire in a grocery at Monroe and Fifth Avenue, which was also called Wells Street, he could see sparks coming from what turned out to be a fire at a wood planing mill just west of the river. Then Box 287 rang out from the courthouse bell, pinpointing the location of the fire as being on Canal Street at Jackson. By the time Little Giant Engine 6 arrived, becoming first on the scene, the entire 2-story building was on fire. Despite the assistance provided by additional companies responding on the first box alarm, awnings on buildings to the north were set ablaze by falling sparks. The area had come to be known as the Red Flash by insurance men because of the frequency of fires in its many lumber yards and coal yards. With piles of lumber in front of the mill also catching fire, the blaze jumped Canal Street and consumed a wagon works, frame tenements, and 2 more lumber yards, a hotel, and a box factory on the east side of the street. As if the spreading inferno wasn't enough of a challenge, the continuous operation of the apparatus itself and the hazards of being attached to a hydrant on a street with burning buildings also took its toll. Engine 5, called the Chicago, had to be shut down until a burst hose could be replaced. It was no sooner back in service when it stopped working again after it was covered with debris as a wall collapsed onto it from a building that was burning while the engine was attached to a hydrant in front. This forced the engineer and the stoker to run for their lives, and so it went. It wasn't until 3 o'clock on Sunday morning that the fire was brought under control. By then, several acres had burned, which included 4 blocks of businesses and houses between Adams and Jackson, from Clinton east to the river. Smoke and haze from the coal piles and lumber yards that burned still hung in the air later that morning, as the Sunday Tribune was offering profound praise for the performance of the fire department, calling it, quote, one of the most remarkable achievements on record, unquote. Engine crews were still putting out hot spots from the fire through Sunday afternoon, with Wabansia Engine 2 ultimately picking up their hose as late as 3 p.m. and the crew of Engine 5 at 4:30. Engine 6 stayed until about 8:30 p.m., having worked 22 hours straight. Chief Williams spoke earlier on Sunday to fire alarm repairmen who indicated many of the area's overhead circuit wires running from street boxes to the fire alarm office in the courthouse had been damaged by the Saturday night fire, but that they would be able to make a temporary fix of the problem. A test of the system was made later Sunday afternoon, and it reportedly worked. After some rest at his home in an apartment above a bakery at Randolph and Fifth Avenue, Williams had supper with his wife around 7 o'clock. A bit later, he responded to a box alarm for a chimney fire at 12th and Clark Streets, which didn't amount to much. While being driven back home in his buggy, the wind was blowing fiercely, and he had to pull his hat down several times to keep it from blowing off. As Williams later learned, Patrick O'Leary was closing the window blinds of his cottage on DeKoven Street around 9 o'clock that evening. Meanwhile, his wife Catherine was walking friends who had been visiting them to the corner to catch one of the Jefferson Street horse cars, which was the main means of public transportation at the time. Trying to determine why the cows were making a commotion in the barn behind their home, Patrick could see that it was on fire. At almost the same time, a shed behind the barn to the south, which was full of wood shavings to be used as kindling in the coming winter, also caught fire and went up fast. Seeing some boys in a nearby alley, O'Leary called on them to bring him some water, which they did, but it was already too late. A fresh load of hay the O'Learys had put in the barn the day before was producing a smoky fire that could be seen all over the neighborhood. Despite his handicap, Peg Leg Sullivan ran across the street from his mother's front yard into the burning barn to try to cut the stock free, since one of the cows was hers. Inside the barn, his wooden leg got caught in a crack in the floor. He was trapped there until he managed to slip it off. He saved himself by grabbing onto the neck of a frantic calf, which was able to find its way out. Other neighbors threw pails of water on the fire and tried to save the O'Leary's wagon and the rest of their stock, but to no avail. As Williams and others later learned, the fire didn't start like the newspapers said. There was no room to milk cows in the barn. Mrs. O'Leary milked her cows outside, tied to the fence alongside the barn, where there was plenty of manure. Based on what he heard from Chris Schimmels, foreman of Engine 5, Williams believed that the fire started in the dried manure, probably from a discarded cigar thrown by someone passing by, or a squatter living in the empty barn across the alley from the O'Learys. He considered the cow kicking over the lantern a sensational yarn, but not factual. At about 9:20 that evening, little more than half an hour after returning from the Saturday night fire, Joseph Lager, the stoker of Engine 6, was in the watchtower of the engine house, which was on Maxwell Street between Canal and Clinton. He called down to Foreman William Musham about a site fire, which was the term used for a fire that was reported by someone who was in or had been near the firehouse itself. Musham quickly hitched the engine's team of horses and triggered Box 298 on the front of the house to alert the fire alarm office that they were on their way toward the red glow Lager had seen from the watchtower. At almost the same time, John Dorsey, foreman of America Hose 2 on Blue Island south of Harrison Street, was alerted by a visitor he had been talking to about a fire that could be seen out the window. The horses were quickly hitched up. Dorsey sent an alarm from box 292 outside the firehouse, and Hose 2 was on its way, stopping briefly at Halsted Street to pick up Charles Anderson, the company driver who had been at home for supper. In those days, firemen were required to live near the quarters where they were assigned. They worked 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, and had 1 day off. They took turns going home for most meals. A fire alarm repairman named William J. Brown was filling in as a night operator that evening in the fire alarm office on the third floor of City Hall, and couldn't decide if the glow he saw to the south was from the smoldering piles of coal from the Saturday night fire or from a new blaze. Both Brown and Matthias Schaefer, the watchman in the cupola above the courthouse, had company visiting while they were at work that evening. When Schaefer realized what he saw to the south was definitely a new fire, he whistled into the speaking tube to Brown in the office below to call for box 342 at Halsted and Canalport to be rung out. Within 4 minutes after Lager had alerted Musham about what he had seen from their watchtower, Engine 6 had reached the O'Leary's burning property. Pipeman John Campion had driven the company's hose cart up to the hydrant at DeKoven and Jefferson Streets, where he pulled off the hose, attached the nozzle pipe, and led the hose out toward the blazing barn while the engine was being hooked up to a hydrant. Chief Williams, who was asleep when the alarm rang out over the courthouse bell, was awakened by his wife as soon as she heard it go off. Accustomed to dressing and getting to the street quickly, he didn't bother to count the box numbers sounding from the courthouse, figuring his driver would know the location when he arrived with his buggy. Thinking it might be a rekindled from the night before, he soon learned it was from a different location as they started for Canalport, which crosses Halsted at about 21st Street, racing across the Randolph Street Bridge and turning south on Des Plaines. As they started to turn west from Des Plaines onto Harrison Street toward Halsted, they could see that smoke from the fire was still ahead of them, though more toward the east. Figuring the watchman in the tower must have made a mistake about the location of the fire, Williams told his driver to go south on Halsted and turn east on Taylor. He stepped off his buggy at Des Plaines and saw a hose line belonging to Hose Company 2 in the alley leading to the O'Leary barn. Connected to the hydrant at Clinton and Taylor, the line had low pressure because it was plugged directly into the hydrant rather than into an engine that would have produced greater water pressure. Williams could see that a shed on each side of the O'Leary's barn and 2 buildings across the alley to the north were burning, and that a few other outbuildings were also on fire. Although he could feel a brisk breeze blowing, he didn't think the fire was getting out of control and ran east to Clinton Street to see if any other engines were coming in. When he didn't see any, he went back to where Engine 6 had led out a line down to Coven and through a lot east of the O'Leary's house to the barn on the back of the lot. Musham was manning the pipe with Campion, while Assistant Marshal Matt Benner was heeling the line. Even with the help of the Assistant Marshal, the company was short-handed, at least initially. Pipeman Frank Howard was laid up, and Pipeman Michael Dolan was at home on leave for dinner. Meanwhile, confusion over the actual location of the fire was causing valuable time to be lost by additional fire companies that might have kept it from spreading. The fireman on watch in the tower above Illinois Engine 15's quarters at 22nd and May saw the glow from the O'Leary fire about 1.5 miles away and called it to the attention of Foreman Bill Mullen. They wondered why the courthouse bell had not yet rung for the fire when their house gong started clanging for box 342, barely 4 blocks away at Canalport in Halstead, which they thought must be a new fire. As they arrived on the scene, a crowd of people that had gathered there urged them to keep going to the glow they could see in the distance. Taking a hydrant at Des Plaines and Taylor Streets, Engine 15's crew led out down Taylor and took a position in front of the fire, which the wind was pushing northward. Chief Williams himself helped with the pipe until the short-handed crew could drag their line to where they could direct its stream to the back of buildings facing Taylor. What bothered Williams at this point was why none of the O'Leary's neighbors had pulled any of the street alarm boxes there, which he thought would have alerted the watchman at City Hall to correct his misjudgment of the location of the fire much earlier and sent more fire companies sooner. One such company was Engine 17, also called the R.A. Williams, which was named for the chief himself and occupied a house on Lake between Clinton and Jefferson Streets. At about 9:10 that night, Daniel O'Connell, the watchman in their tower, gave a sight alarm for the O'Leary fire. They had their horses hitched and were ready to go when box 342 was sounded. Since that was not in their district, they unhitched their horses and went back to what they had been doing. It was another 30 minutes before the second alarm came in for the O'Leary fire, which they then took in. Earlier Sunday night, when Bill Lee, a neighbor of the O'Learys, saw the back of another neighbor's house ablaze, he ran to Gall's German apothecary at 12th and Canal and stammered something to Bruno Gohl, which Gohl couldn't understand right away because English wasn't his first language. When he finally figured out what Lee wanted, he opened the firebox there and turned the crank to sound the alarm. It wasn't until some time later that Chief Williams became aware that neither that box nor any of the other alarms from the neighborhood were being received by the fire alarm office. It appeared that the temporary fix to the alarm system that was made after the Saturday night fire had not been successful after all, and had caused delays in the responses of several fire companies to the fast-moving Sunday fire. Meanwhile, Engine 6 pipeman Dolan, who had been on time off at his home for dinner, saw the fire and ran to alert the crews of Chicago Engine 5 and Protection Hook and Ladder 2 in their new house on Jefferson south of Jackson. After hitching a ride to the scene with Engine 5 and finding his Engine 6, he was ordered by Marshal Benner, together with pipeman John Campion, to lead out a second line from their engine to the fire that was quickly spreading. As if the fast-moving fire wasn't enough of a challenge, the line Engine 5 laid down burst a hose, which the crew wrapped in blankets, trying to avoid having to shut it down. When that didn't work, the steamer was shut down to change out that length of hose, and more precious minutes were lost putting water on the fire. While Engine 6 had 2 lines on the fire from the south, Williams asked some spectators to help Hose 2's driver, Charlie Anderson, back their line away and move it to buildings on the north side of Taylor Street. Before that could be done, however, the hose line went limp. It appeared that Wabansia Engine 2 had hooked up to the hydrant at Taylor and Clinton after responding first to box 342 and had lost steam pressure in their boiler due to not having enough coal after the long trip from their quarters near 24th and Low. This action also shut down the streams of both Hose 2 and Hose 1, which were using the same hydrant. Once sidewalk planks could be cut up for kindling to restoke Engine 2's boiler, the crew led up Taylor Street and worked between buildings. With the arrival of T.B. Brown, Engine 12, from quarters at Lake and Paulina, and taking a position on Canal north of Arthington, Chief Williams felt he had the fire surrounded. He had Engine 2 on the east side of the fire, even though the fire had jumped to the north side of the alley and was reaching the back of buildings facing Taylor Street, where Engine 5 had moved its lead into a position to help out. With little warning, the fire then spread to a barn on the west end of the alley between DeKoven and Taylor and reached a block of two-story, flat-roofed frame buildings on Jefferson north of DeKoven. Facing that reality, Williams called for a second alarm to be turned in. The next setback came when the hose cart of William James Engine 3 arrived without the engine, which was out of service after almost being lost in the fire the night before. The hose that engineer Charles Petrie brought allowed Engine 5 to put a second line on the fire, but the water pressure soon dropped again when the engine broke down. The fire then jumped to the north side of Taylor just before 10 p.m. It became apparent to Chief Williams that Engine 5 had not been properly prepared for further service after the Saturday night fire, and the company's hose cart was sent back to quarters for more coal. It took some time for the driver to make the trip, shovel the coal from the basement to the sidewalk, and from the sidewalk onto the hose cart before returning to the fire. Meanwhile, the crew at the scene tore up wooden fencing and sidewalks for fuel to relight the engine's boiler. When foreman Nick Dubach arrived with the crew of Economy Engine 8 from their quarters on Archer and Dearborn, he could see where the fire was heading and took his hose line to Taylor so he could lead in from the north, even though his engine had taken the hydrant south of the fire. At that point, he was stopped by Marshal Benner and ordered back around to DeKoven Street to the south, figuring that Engine 5 already had a pipe working north of the fire. This was an order Williams figured Benner would soon regret, thinking that if Engine 8 had let in from the north as Dubach wanted, they would have been in a position to cut off the fire. That may just have been wishful thinking on Chief Williams' part, however, since he was not immune from misjudgments of his own. The second alarm had now been sounded by the fire alarm office based on more accurate sightings by the watchman in the courthouse cupola, which brought downtown fire companies to the O'Leary fire. Frank Sweeney, foreman of Pioneer Hook and Ladder 1, heard the alarm while at his home for dinner. Running to the firehouse, his truck shared with Long John Engine 1 on LaSalle north of Madison, he found both companies had already left. A man of energy and integrity, Sweeney ran east to State Street, where he caught a horse car to ride south to 12th Street. From there, he ran west to join his company, which was tearing down fences near the O'Leary barn. Approaching the fire from the north, Engine 1 met up with Frank Sherman, Engine 9, coming from quarters at 25th and Cottage Grove. Both crews worked for a time at Clinton and Taylor. Then Engine 9 was ordered by Marshal Benner to get its own lead and use Truck 2's ladder to reach the second floor of a building east of the O'Leary property to help Engine 8's crew, which was already working there. Soon Engine 8 was forced out by the heat. About that time also, Engine 2 had to abandon its plug on Taylor. With the fire now moving quickly, there was no time to bring up the horses, and the firemen had to pull the engine away by themselves to keep it from being engulfed. At this point, the fire was truly getting out of control. Some bystanders were called upon to use a ladder put up by Truck 2 and climb to the roof of a building north of Taylor to stamp out falling sparks, and were initially successful. Then fire broke out in a butcher shop in the middle of the structure, and Marshal Benner ordered Engine 5 into the building to work their pipe. Nearing the top of the stairs on the east side of the building, a blast of heat and flame knocked the crew down. They didn't realize it at first, but Engine 6 was already working a line from the south end, blowing it all their way. Among others, the second alarm for the fire brought in J.B. Rice, Engine 10, from quarters on State just south of Congress. Capable of sending a stream 175 feet high through a 1¼ inch nozzle, Engine 10 took a hydrant at Jefferson and Ewing, which is now called Cabrini, and led south to Taylor and east toward Clinton. Meanwhile, Engine 1 worked from a plug at Canal and Taylor, leading west on Taylor. Despite their powerful streams, the fire pushed them back after only about 5 minutes, and before they knew it, almost everything on the east side of Jefferson was burning north to just beyond Harrison Street. At about 10:30 p.m., Williams ordered a third or general alarm to be turned in, which meant the entire department was required to respond. While this never registered due to the wires being down, the fire was of such magnitude that the fire alarm office rang for that level of response based on what could be seen from the courthouse watchtower. With that, A.D. Titsworth, Engine 13, responded out of their quarters at 97 Dearborn, just north of Washington Street, crossed the river on the Madison Street Bridge, and headed south on Jefferson. 13's crew then worked in a series, taking water from Engine 10 at Cabrini Street. When a line was dragged south to Arthington, 5 lengths of hose burst within 10 minutes and had to be changed. By then, the heat and flames were intense, so they led out east down Cabrini, where they worked for a while behind buildings on the east side of Jefferson, north to Polk, saving those buildings. The northeasterly blowing wind was now becoming real cause for concern. At about 10:45 p.m., Police Captain Hickey informed Williams that the cupola on St. Paul's Church was on fire about 2 blocks north of the O'Leary blaze, leaving Benner in charge. Williams ordered companies coming in from the north on the third alarm to handle the church fire before it could spread. On arrival from quarters on Larrabee at North Avenue, the Jacob Ream, Engine 4, took a hydrant at Clinton and Mather, later called Lexington, where it was assisted by Lincoln Hose 4, coming in from a house it would later share with Engine 22 on Webster, just east of Lincoln Avenue. The apparent origin of the church fire was typical of the likely cause of many of the fires that broke out that night at some distance from the O'Leary blaze. The northeasterly wind that had been of growing concern to Williams picked up burning embers, which it then dropped on rooftops in various places, such as the Central Business District and on the north side, spreading the fire in ways that were almost impossible to keep up with. Another roadblock to the department's ability to respond to fires across town in a timely manner was the apparent lack of coordination among some services. When the AC Coventry Engine 11 was responding to the O'Leary fire on the third alarm from their quarters on Hubbard east of State, they were delayed for 15 minutes waiting for the State Street swing bridge to be closed after being opened for boats to get through. Tunnels had recently built under the river at Washington and at LaSalle, so street traffic could bypass the frequent bridge openings, but the depths of the tunnels made it difficult for horses to pull heavy wagons or fire apparatus up the steep inclines. Regarding the fire at St. Paul's Church, a hose line from Engine 14 was brought up by ladder to try to save the flat roof. When that didn't appear to work, Ben Buckwinkle's Fire Insurance Patrol helped firemen remove religious objects from the church before its roof caved in. Still trying to show confidence that the fire could be contained, Williams helped Engine 4's crew change their lead from the church to the west side of the street to keep the fire from spreading. Then he saw that the fire had reached the Garden City Match Factory north of the church and the lumber yard just beyond that on Clinton, before moving across the yard of Bateman's Shingle Mills. As if these establishments didn't provide enough fuel for the advancing fire, The attic of one of the Bateman buildings was occupied by a furniture company, and the rest by a furniture finishing company, where lacquers, varnishes, wood furniture, and scrap abounded, while an adjacent yard was full of wood shavings. Bateman ordered his workmen to flood the mill yard with water to save his extensive holdings, but his efforts were in vain. The fires soon spread into the lumber yards to the north and east. Foreman Dennis Sweeney kept engine 14 pumping on Canal Street until wood piles on both sides of the engine caught fire. He crawled under the rig himself to unhook the suction hose so it could be pulled away by hand with help from Truck 1's crew, which was led by his brother Frank. Frank's crew was soon called upon to help Engine 11 move east on Polk from Clinton to Canal as the O'Leary fire pushed in that direction. With flames approaching, residents on the west side of Canal Street did something that was repeated in other parts of the city and only added to the difficulty of controlling the fast-moving fire. They carried furniture out of their homes and piled it up on the other side of the street, hoping to save it. Instead, what they did only helped spread the fire, as the wind sent burning mattresses flying and igniting more structures. The streets themselves contributed to the chaos. Besides the wooden fences that linked buildings together like fuses, a lot of street pavement consisted of pine blocks soaked with oily creosote to preserve the wood, which burned the blocks in parallel lines. Anxious to help the fire department control the peril the city was in, former Alderman Hank Hildreth suggested to Williams that blowing up buildings might be a way to create fire breaks. Although he had no experience working with explosive powder himself, Williams was aware that it had been used for that purpose elsewhere and gave Hildreth his support, provided he had the written approval of Mayor Roswell Mason. At about this point, Williams ordered John Doyle, the engineer of Ream Engine 4, that his rig needed to be disconnected as quickly as possible from the hydrant across from the church at Lexington and Des Plaines, or it would be consumed by the fire. Doyle said he had to refill his boiler first to keep up the pressure. By the time that was done, it was too late to hitch the horses, so the crew hauled the rig away by hand. After taking up another position at Jefferson and putting out small fires in 2 nearby buildings, the engine ran out of coal. So Doyle sent men to a neighbor's house to borrow enough to keep the engine running until they could get a coal wagon to show up. It was a struggle, but engines 4 and 13 were able to keep the fire from spreading west beyond Jefferson Street, north of Cabrini. Engine 13 took a hydrant between Harrison and Van Buren, and the crew led east down an alley to Clinton, where they were able to save the Keeley soda water plant as well. The crew of Engine 10 had the demeaning experience of directing ineffective streams on the Nelson grain elevator, which had been saved from the fire the night before through the valiant efforts of Engine 5. This time, neither Engine 15 nor 10 could provide streams of water powerful enough to reach the top of the elevator, where the fire, most likely started by a burning ember, had taken hold and grown, fed by the fierce wind. Meanwhile, Williams ordered Engine 15 to the railroad freight house at Jackson and Canal, where they worked from the dock between the river and the freight house so they could draft water directly from the river. Remaining there until Tuesday morning, they were able to save the Adams Street Bridge, the freight house, and a yard full of passenger cars. Together with these achievements and the ruins of the Saturday night fire that left little else to burn, Williams was reported to express the optimistic and equally unrealistic view that he still hoped the fire could be stopped in the West Division, which meant everywhere west of the river. It was at about 11:15 Sunday night when the fire reached the lumber yard east of Canal Street. In response, Marshal Benner sent engines 4, 6, 9, and 10 to the foot of Taylor Street. Drawing water from hydrants and the river, they fought to save two large warehouses belonging to the Chicago Dock Company with a reported $1 million in merchandise stored inside. Successful at first, they remained there until daylight on Monday in a valiant effort to put the fire out. Defying every effort of Williams and his crews to get ahead of the fire, the highly combustible lumber yards, furniture factories, and mills between Canal and the river continued to feed on each other until the entire neighborhood was in flames. When Williams saw that Engine 14 was in imminent danger of being engulfed while working on Van Buren Street, he warned Foreman Dennis Sweeney to move his rig, but it was too late. Within minutes, Chicago's steam engine force was down to 15 companies. As most others could have predicted, with the wind still blowing multiple embers through the air, the inevitable finally happened. The fire reached the business district in what was called the South Division, and was burning the stable of the Parmalee omnibus and stage line at Jackson and Franklin. Scheduled for an official opening only days away, the recently completed three-story building had been stocked with fresh hay just hours before. Even with employees stationed on the roof to stamp out any embers that might fall there, the rain of fire was too much for them, and they fled for their lives. Coming to grips with the dramatic new reality, Williams ordered Engine 1 foreman Alex McMonagle to take his rig from the West Division across the Madison Street Bridge and into the business district. He believed the Van Buren Street Bridge was no longer safe to use because the adjacent railroad viaduct had been damaged in the Saturday night fire. Then he climbed aboard Washington Hose Cart 5, telling its driver to follow Engine 1, which headed to the Adams Street Bridge and across to where the gasworks stood. Williams found that the fire had already reached Adams and Market Streets, where Wacker Drive is today. At Monroe, Williams came upon Assistant Marshal John Shank, who had ordered Engine 8 to come over to the South Division from Clinton Street, but that they had crossed without their hose cart. They found Engine 1's hose cart at Market and Monroe, so they took the hydrant in front of Farwell's warehouse and worked with Engine 1 to keep the fire from reaching the express barn near Fifth Avenue. The scenes at the Madison and Randolph Street bridges were now getting chaotic as crowds surged west and north from the business district as fire companies tried to return to keep the fire from spreading throughout the area. Embers were falling almost everywhere, setting fire to the gasworks and a nearby roofing company and tar shed on Adams between Market Street and Fifth Avenue. Shortly after midnight Monday morning, Williams reported fire breaking out from embers falling on a three-story frame tenement on the north side of Adams, east of the gasworks. Many of the area residents were Irish immigrants who lived in shanties and lean-tos that would easily be consumed by fire. Roused from their beds, they fled in various stages of dress, some pushing anything on wheels that could carry their children and whatever possessions they might also be able to save. Engine 11 used the Polk Street Bridge to reach the fire in that area from the O'Leary fire, where they had been working, but were soon forced out by the intensity of the flames. Facing a similar situation, Engine 1 was also unable to stay attached to the hydrant at Adams and LaSalle while fighting the gasworks fire, and moved their position east to Adams and Clark Streets. Although the wind was blowing the other way, the fire spread south across Adams Street from the gasworks and set the Armory ablaze on the southwest corner of Adams and Franklin. From there, the fire reached two frame buildings to the south and then into an entire block of buildings on Fifth Avenue. Williams said that by about 12:30 Monday morning, street alarm boxes were pulled in rapid succession at Van Buren Market, Madison and Market, and from the Metropolitan Hotel at Randolph and Fifth Avenue, indicating the fire was within a block of City Hall and the courthouse. Not long afterward, Dennis Deneen called down from the courthouse watchtower to the fire alarm office in City Hall that a wooden ventilator in the west wing of the courthouse was on fire. Night operator George Fuller relayed the message to police headquarters in the basement there, and an officer was sent with a Babcock extinguisher to put out the fire. The rain of sparks and embers continued relentlessly, however, and it wasn't long before separate fires in the heart of the city became one, and 4 square blocks became a raging inferno, which burned City Hall and the courthouse themselves, with the wind making efforts to control it next to impossible. New buildings are old. The fire wasn't particular about which to destroy. The Bryan Block, on the northwest corner of LaSalle and Monroe, had only recently been completed and was being called the best office building in the city. Then came the 5-story Otis Block to the south and the Nixon Block, which was considered fireproof. Built on a cast iron frame covered with heavy masonry, it had no woodwork or window frames because the building was not yet completed. The structure survived intact, but that didn't keep the fire from jumping over it to the Republic Life Insurance Building at Arcade Court, 2 more office buildings on LaSalle, and another that fronted on Madison, setting all ablaze. There had been a continuous rain of embers across the river for some time, so that just about everything was on fire from Jackson to Monroe and from the river east to Fifth Avenue. Williams knew he had to get in front of the fire, which soon consumed 2 Sturgis stores on Madison east of LaSalle, each only about a year old. Despite forming a line of engines on Madison Street, the fire department's defenses began to crumble after the main fire column crossed Monroe Street, and there was a constant shower of embers from a burning picture frame factory. Seeing that Engine 11 was running short-handed, Williams grabbed the brass nozzle attached to the hose on their hose wagon as it took off toward the engine at the hydrant, threw the pipe over one shoulder and a length of coiled-up hose over the other, and headed toward some low buildings behind the grander ones on LaSalle Street. Williams broke the glass in a door of one of the buildings, cutting his hand in the process, charged in to hit the fire with a blast of water, and moved the pipe from side to side. He crawled on his hands and knees to avoid the heat and thought he had won the bout, but was losing the fight because the building was now burning on the outside. Block by block, Williams saw the destruction of some of the business district's finest structures, which he was reluctant to lose to the flames, but felt he had to use all the resources he could gather effectively to keep the fire from spreading farther north. He could only watch as the picturesque Garden City House Hotel burned like a tinderbox, its iron columns melting like paraffin wax, and learned firemen were forced to flee when the Union National Bank building on LaSalle at Washington burned, along with Oriental Hall, which he considered one of the finest Masonic halls in the country. When Williams saw that the courthouse tower had caught fire, he ordered Engine 11 to connect to a hydrant at Randolph and LaSalle, but was told they couldn't go to work because their suction taper was accidentally broken when it was being disconnected from a hydrant on Madison. Pipeman Dan Healy drove their team to Engine 13's quarters a short distance away to make the needed repairs, while the hose cart was driven to the hose repair shop behind the waterworks on what became Chicago Avenue, where a new taper was secured. The courthouse occupied the south portion of a square facing Randolph between Clark and LaSalle Streets, with a lawn covering the rest, where the City Hall and county buildings stand today. 2 wings were added in 1858 to the original courthouse building that was completed 5 years earlier. Like today, city offices occupied the west wing and Cook County the east. The Astronomical Society had a 4-faced clock installed in the watchtower in the spring of 1871, but one of the clocks had been removed for repair, leaving a large open space. The watchtower also housed a 5.5-ton fire alarm bell, which had been ringing almost non-stop during the night as the fires spread. When the courthouse itself succumbed to the flames, the bell collapsed with it. Any further alarm signals that might have been used to direct fire companies to where they were needed would have to rely on other means of communication. When former Alderman Hildreth arrived with a wagon load of gunpowder he had secured from the city magazine, Williams suggested that it be used to blow up the 4-story Union National Bank building on the southwest corner of LaSalle and Washington Streets. He believed an explosion there would take down the bank and level adjacent buildings, which would keep the fire from spreading northward. As it turned out, the blast only blew out the windows of the solidly built bank, but little else. The Merchants Insurance Building, on the northwest corner of that same intersection, housed the Smith Brothers Bank and the telegraph offices of Western Union and the Associated Press. With the fire raging just outside, clerks and operators in the telegraph offices worked until the roof caught fire to get out word of the conflagration to the world beyond. After an Associated Press reporter was cut off in the midst of his transmission, he and some of the other employees escaped to a suburban location with General Philip Sheridan, who was using offices in the building for his headquarters. It took multiple efforts to save the Madison Street Bridge. With the fire burning west against the wind at about 2:30 Monday morning, the Myers Whiskey distilleries near the bridge exploded. Another distillery east of the river, along with a coal yard, also caught fire, which threatened to burn the bridge. With no engines available, Oriental Flouring Mill's owner, Ed Norton, and police officer Simmons used a powerful force pump at the mill to play 2 streams of water on the bridge. Bridge operator Andrew Boyer helped by swinging the burning end of the bridge to the west side so fire companies still working on that side of the river could put out the fire. Williams believed that saving the Madison Street Bridge not only saved the lives of many of the fleeing refugees, but also kept fires in the business district from being blown back west to consume buildings and lumber yards which survived the fire that had devastated the area on Saturday night. Another timely act that would prove to be most helpful to the city's later recovery occurred as flames reached the Larman Block on the northeast corner of Washington and Clark Streets. Besides the Fifth National Bank and other businesses, the 5-story marble-faced building housed the abstract firm of Shorthall and Horde. Many of Chicago's land records were lost when the courthouse burned, but John Shorthall knew they could be reconstructed later from ledgers of the abstract men. He and his clerks worked as quickly as they could to carry the ledgers outside, and one of Shorthall's neighbors came with a wagon to move the ledgers to safety. Inside one of the city's finest brick and marble buildings that were lost when the fire spread east on Washington Street was the office of Allan Pinkerton, the detective who started an agency in Chicago in 1852. Not having purchased fireproof safes, he lost the records from his time guarding President Lincoln, among other valuable papers. Also burned was his home on Adams Street, which had been an early stop on the Underground Railroad, where runaway slaves would wait until they could catch a ship bound for freedom in Canada. Throughout the growing conflagration, Williams continued to express optimism that the fire could be contained if only some unlikely beneficial condition would occur. It seemed like he was constantly trying to convince future skeptics that he was doing all he could with the manpower and equipment available, which had merit but was not realistic. For instance, he still thought he could save the Sherman House and the north side of Randolph Street even when much of the business district was already in flames, and few engines with limited lengths of hose and exhausted fire crews were in a position to slow the rapid advance of the fire. When he found Dennis Sweeney coming down Randolph with the hose cart of Engine 14, Williams directed him to give 2 lengths of hose to Engine 8 so they could stretch a line across the street to the Sherman House. As it turned out, Engine 14's crew was able to stay by the hotel for only a few minutes, since they had no hose at all. Soon the stables in back caught fire. The remaining guests fled in panic, and the hotel went down in minutes. Still optimistic, Williams thought some progress was being made when he saw that the fire had again outflanked him and had come down Lake Street, burning all the wood buildings on the south side of the street. Engine 8 was working on the corner of Lake and LaSalle when Heath and Mulligan's 5-story oil establishment went off like volleys of artillery, blowing out the front wall of the building and engulfing the engine across the street. Foreman Nick Dubach had to crawl under the engine to disconnect the suction hose so it could be moved. By then, the Wells Street Bridge was on fire, and the engine had to be driven through a veritable firestorm to reach the Lake Street Bridge so it could cross to the west. Williams realized that the fame and lavish amenities of the city's finest remaining hotels couldn't save them from the fate of the Sherman House. Engine 1 had taken the hydrant at Jackson and Clark and led a single line on the massive Grand Pacific Hotel. Built of Cleveland stone, the Grand Pacific took up the entire block between Clark and LaSalle from Quincy to Jackson. Still under construction, it had large tanks under the roof that could hold 12,000 gallons of water capable of flooding any portion of the building in case of fire. With the structure not yet complete, the tanks weren't filled. The engine's pipe couldn't reach the upper floors where the fire was raging, and there wasn't even enough hose for a second line. Reaper manufacturer Cyrus McCormick, who had moved to New York, was in Chicago on business and had just been burned out of his rooms at the Sherman House when he was forced to move again at about 2 o'clock Monday morning as the fire reached the mansion of his brother, where he had just taken refuge, at Rush and Ontario Streets. An hour later, Williams got word that even the waterworks at Chicago Avenue was on fire, again as the all-too-familiar result of embers landing on the roof. North Division Marshal Lawrence Walters ordered Huck Hose 3 to direct a plug stream on the waterworks until an engine could be sent there, but it was already too late. The whole roof was ablaze. Catching fire soon after the waterworks was the Lil and Diversey Brewery, which occupied property across the street between Chicago and Superior from Pine Street east to the lakefront. A half-dozen other breweries along the waterfront, north of the waterworks, were also threatened. Trying to hold the line north of the river, Engine 11 foreman Lawrence Walsh led out from the river on the Revere House Hotel that was burning at Clark and Kinsey Streets, but stayed only about 10 minutes before the fire crossed Kinsey and ignited buildings on Illinois Street. A short time later, a cottage went up on Ohio near Judge Lambert Tree's residence. After his barn caught fire at around 3 a.m., the judge gathered up his family and fled north. When Chicago Historical Society librarian William Cochran went to check on the museum at Dearborn and Ontario Streets, he saw that the cellar door had been forced open and was afraid there had been a burglary. He discovered that residents of the neighborhood had taken their valuables there, believing they could be saved from the fire since the stone structure was deemed to be perfectly fireproof. Cochran found keys that unlocked the frame, holding an original copy of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which the president himself had donated to benefit the Sanitary Fair in Chicago during the Civil War. Cochran rolled the document up in some war-torn battle flags. Then he moved it, along with Lincoln's walking stick, a spear that belonged to John Brown, a bust of Lincoln by Leonard Volk, and some Healy paintings to what he thought was a safe place in the center of the building. Sadly, these buildings were among a vast number of valuable items that were lost when the structure burned. With the fire raging both north and south of the river, the State Street Bridge burned and fell into the river. A long wooden viaduct just north of the river also burned, as did a brick warehouse west of it used by the Northwestern Railroad. Fires were also advancing south of the river, where Williams learned some engines were able to find what was called dead water to use, since the waterworks was no longer functioning. Dead water was what they called water that was still trapped inside pipes in low areas. When the fire reached the roof of the Gale Brothers drugstore on Randolph at Wells Street, Williams directed Engine 5's crew to bring their lead to the rear of the store, but found the fire was soon blowing out the front. He then had them take their lead down LaSalle Street and directed the crews of Engine 17 and Hose 1 to lead off down Wells Street in an effort to throw the fire off to the northeast. The fire then literally hit home for Williams, who lived with his wife in an apartment above Thompson's Bakery, which was across the street and a few doors west of the drugstore. Arriving there, he found Police Captain Miller and other friends helping to remove furniture, the carpet, and a stove down and out of the building after seeing to his wife's safety. Williams had to leave their piano, but he was able to save his prized silver speaking trumpet that was given to him by members of a volunteer engine company he had served as foreman. Soon the bakery was in flames. Once outside, Williams saw that the street had heaved up around the sewer at the corner. Later, he followed the sewer line back toward the gasworks and found the same situation in several locations, which reinforced his belief that gas from the gasworks had been siphoned into the sewer. Having heard from some firemen and bystanders that they had seen blue flames in the sewer grates and basements of buildings not yet threatened, Williams concluded that the dumping of gas into the city's sewer system had contributed to the speedy spread of the fire. When the main column of the fire in the business district crossed Dearborn between Randolph and the main branch of the river, Williams learned that, as in so many other instances, a blazing ember had landed on the roof of the Tremont House. The third such establishment, named after a famous hotel in Boston, the 5.5-story brick, 260-room Tremont, was the tallest in the city when it was completed in 1850, and the most luxurious. Remodeled a decade later, it had mantels of Egyptian marble, rosewood chairs, and damask curtains, and was the first building in the city with elevators. Although there was panic inside when the hotel started to burn, all got out safely. John Wentworth, the former mayor, left his room with a bellboy who followed behind, carrying his bags across the river to the North Division. Oddly enough, Ira Couch, the Tremont's proprietor, had been a volunteer fireman in his earlier days and had been the steward of Chicago's first salvage company, a predecessor of the Fire Insurance Patrol. Williams was constantly thinking ahead to his next fallback position, he later noted, and felt that the solid walls of the fireproof post office and customs house at Dearborn and Monroe could put up some strong resistance to the fire. By 2 a.m. Monday morning, his wishful thinking was being put to the test. Taking no chances, Post Office Superintendent Harris and his crew had been packing up mail for transport to a safer location. When the gas lights went out, they worked by candlelight and the light of buildings burning around them. By 4:45 a.m., however, the postal clerks were forced to leave. It was apparent that iron shutters on some of the first-floor windows that had been removed for repairs earlier in the year were never put back. By 5 a.m., Crosby's Opera House, which was set to reopen on the north side of Washington, west of State, after a summer-long $80,000 renovation, was also marked for destruction. Booked for the grand reopening was the Theodore Thomas Orchestra, which would become the Chicago Symphony some years later. Among a lengthy list of hotels, commercial buildings, and cultural institutions that had recently either opened or been renovated, Crosby's quickly succumbed to Chicago's worst nightmare. While the fire in the business district had stayed mainly west of Dearborn between Van Buren and Madison Streets, at about 7 a.m. Monday, a sudden gust of wind blew some live embers across Dearborn, setting fire to the Dearborn Theater and other wooden structures to the east and north. The 5-story stone Chicago Daily Times building burned in about 30 minutes. Just north of Madison on Dearborn was the 3-story brick quarters of Engine 13, which had been built for Volunteer Engine 1 in 1856. Although the crew played a line on it, they couldn't save it. The 8-story Palmer House Hotel, which had been opened by Potter Palmer on State Street at Monroe only days earlier, was passed over by an earlier wave of the fire. By 8 a.m. on Monday, however, even with fire guards manning hose lines on every floor, it was attacked again, and guests were forced to leave. By 9 o'clock, it was gone, sending debris through the skylight of the Academy of Design about 20 feet away. Earlier that evening, the secretary of the Academy ordered a huge painting of the Battle of Gettysburg to be cut from its frame and taken to what was thought to be a safe place. The Academy held artworks of some of the city's most prominent artists and was funded largely by Leonard Volk, the sculptor who made a life mask and busts of Lincoln, and the statue at the top of the monument to volunteer firemen at Rose Hill Cemetery. One of the grand news stores destroyed by the fire Monday morning on State Street was that of the Mandel Brothers, which was to have had its grand opening later in the day. The crew of Engine 12 tried to save it, but couldn't develop enough water pressure to hit the second floor. The new structure burned to the ground, along with its entire stock of new merchandise. Among the many problems the fire department was facing at this time was the breakdown of equipment and the loss of hose due to its almost continuous use since the start of the Saturday night fire, as well as the exhaustion of the firemen required to operate it all with basically no rest. A machinist named George Hannis owned a wagon shop where the boilers and rescued parts from engines 3 and 17 were taken after being damaged in the Saturday night fire. With the help of a supply wagon driver, Williams and a group of men he rounded up started loading the repaired equipment from Hannis's shop to take it where it could be put back in service. While they were working, the building next door caught fire, and soon Hannis's shop itself was burning. Everyone got out just in time. Also on Monday, the Tribune building on Madison and Dearborn Streets burned. The 4-story structure of so-called Athens marble had an iron beam skeleton and walls that were 2 feet thick. Publisher Joseph Medill considered it so safe that he carried no insurance on the building or its contents. While the editor stationed men on the roof to put out any sparks that might land there, reporters remained on the third floor writing. The Reynolds block across the street had already burned, and at about 7 a.m., the walls of the four-story building came crashing down, almost catching the fire insurance patrolman who had put out a fire that had started below the Tribune building's sidewalk. When the reporter's copy was ready for printing, it was passed on to pressmen, who took it down to the basement presses. They found the room hot and full of smoke and fire, and that some of the press rollers were already melted. As others who believed in the designation, they learned it was soon all over for the, quote, fireproof, unquote, Tribune building. One of the few victories in the battle to contain the fire occurred at the new 3-block-long freight depot between Sherman Street, now Financial Place, and Griswold, now an extension of LaSalle Street, from Jackson to Harrison. Built of brick and steel, with a slate roof and only a few windows, it was saved by a group of volunteers who brought buckets of water to the few openings, which not only saved the building, but, aided by the stone yard of the nearby Illinois Stone Company, kept the fire from spreading farther south. At that point, with hydrants no longer functioning because the waterworks pumps were down, South Division Assistant Marshal Schenck ordered Engine 8 to the lakefront at the foot of Van Buren Street so water could be drawn directly from the lake. Playing one line into Engine 10, which was positioned on Wabash, there was not enough hose to get a lead that could reach buildings burning on the west side of State Street. When Engine 10's boiler flues began to leak, the engine had to be shut down to make repairs. A frame building on 5th and Harrison was burning when engines 9 and 12 both came on the scene at the same time, and Schenck ordered them to the lakefront also. But Engine 12's foreman, Fred Taplin, had another idea. He wanted to try the hydrant on the corner for dead water, which turned out to be available there, and worked on Harrison to save what they could between Clark and Wabash. The fire spread south from Adams on both Wabash and Michigan, destroying some of the city's finest homes and churches, along with the Chicago Club at Michigan and Van Buren. Determined not to give up the fight, Chiefs Benner and Schenck organized engines in a line up Harrison Street, but needed another engine. They sent for Foreman Musham to bring over Engine 6, which had been working on the ruins of the fire in the West Division after being the first to respond when the O'Leary barn burned. Earlier on Monday morning, the Galena grain elevator near the Rush Street Bridge caught fire from flaming debris blown north across the river. The bridge tender tried to save the bridge itself by swinging it back and forth, but by 9 a.m., it too burned. With the fire then spreading north and east, one of the city's largest industrial firms also fell victim. The McCormick Harvester Works, which occupied several blocks along the river east of Pine Street, produced more than 10,000 reapers and mowers per year, and 2,000 of them were on the docks ready for shipment when the fire raced through. Once the fire took hold on the north side of the river, it seemed to create a firestorm that swept away almost everything in its path. Besides the Harvester Works, that included, among other businesses, the Rathbone Stove Company, built on landfill just south of the Ogden Slip, and the Peabody Coal Company dock at Kinsey. With nothing available to halt its progress, 3 blocks along Dearborn seemed to ignite all at once. The wooden sidewalks, the streets, and everything else was a mass of flame. Among the first cities to help Chicago's exhausted fire crews was Aurora, which sent 4 of its engines and 75 firemen. One of the engines went to work alongside Chicago's Engine 12, drafting water from the lake to play on the Michigan Avenue Hotel. Although the building to the east was already on fire, John Drake, whose Tremont Hotel had burned earlier, walked in and plunked down $1,000 in front of the proprietor for what Drake called a down payment to buy the hotel and its contents. He had seen the activity around the hotel and believed it could be saved. The proprietor thought he was crazy, but accepted his offer. The building survived, and Drake had a hotel on Michigan Avenue that he would reopen not long after the fires were all out, which he promptly renamed the Tremont. Also responding to Chicago's urgent telegraph appeals for help, downstate Bloomington sent a train with a flat car for that city's new double-cylinder steamer and a hose cart, along with a coach for Chief Engineer Marion Chews and 6 of his men. Arriving at about 11:30 Monday morning, they made the 125-mile trip in about 2 hours and 35 minutes. The St. Louis fire chief responded with a steamer and a load of extra hose. A special train was dispatched from Milwaukee with 3 of the city's 5 engines and their crews. Racine also sent an engine, while Waukegan provided 700 feet of much-needed hose. Arriving fire companies had little difficulty finding places to go to work. All a Springfield crew needed to put their steamer and a hose cart with 1,000 feet of hose into operation were horses, which were quickly rounded up. When an employee of a coal and lumber yard at Market and what became Grand Avenue saw 2 of the Milwaukee engine crews hauling their steamers by hand toward the burning yard, he secured horses from a milk wagon team to relieve one of them of that burden. The Milwaukee firemen were able to save the yard and others in the area, keeping the fire from spreading farther west. By 10 a.m. Monday, fires in the North Division were spreading to some of the city's finest churches and the mansions of its most prominent families. Mahlon Ogden, brother of William Ogden, Chicago's first mayor, fought to save his property. After sending his family to safety, he and friends who were staying at his 3-story frame mansion soaked rugs in water and spread them over the mansard roof and other exposed areas. Some of the men stood on the roof with brooms to beat out and sweep off burning embers that landed there. Their efforts helped save his home, which occupied the block between Clark and Dearborn, where the Newberry Library now stands. Police officer Richard Bellinger used similar methods to save his home just west of Lincoln Park. When Engine 14's foreman, Dennis Sweeney, saw that the fire in the North Division was getting close to the Chicago Avenue Bridge, he made his way toward his company's quarters on Chicago at Kingsbury to herd people away from the area. He found several people inside the firehouse, which was still almost new, and told them to leave before they got burned up. They claimed it was an engine house and couldn't burn. Williams learned that 10 bodies were found in the ruins of the house the very next day. At about 11 a.m., with the fire still advancing, Engine 4 returned to their quarters at North and Larrabee to remove equipment and furniture, believing the house was doomed. By evening, they were back in service at the Northside Gas Works on what came to be known as Goose Island because of the geese and ducks kept by the Irish immigrants who lived there. It wasn't really a natural island. It was created by the digging of a canal to connect the ends of a westerly bend in the river. St. Michael's Church, on a block north of North Avenue and west of Sedgwick, was named for the patron saint of Michael Diversey, the brewer who donated the land it was built on. With the fire approaching, the pastor and a priest gathered gold chalices and other items of value, dug pits in the church garden, and buried them. The roof caught first, and flaming brands crashed through stained glass windows on the east side, setting fire to the interior. But the stone walls stood firm and were later used in rebuilding the church. Among the many other communities responding to Chicago's call for help, the Mississippi River city of Quincy sent a train full of supplies and cooked provisions to meet the immediate needs of displaced residents. In thanking Quincy's mayor, Chicago's mayor, Roswell Mason, asked if nails and hardware might also be sent so temporary shelters could be built for the coming winter months. A second train was prepared with those materials, and Quincy's fire chief, Henry Lagaman, sent along a steamer and a chemical engine to help fight the fire itself. Quincy's steamer pumped for 62 hours straight, drafting from the river. The Kirk Soap Factory was among the properties the Quincy crew was credited with saving. They stayed an entire week, spending a lot of time pumping into water mains until the waterworks could be relied upon to provide what was needed. Also helping out was Moline, which sent its almost new first-class Amoskeag plunger engine and crew. 5 engines and their crews from Pittsburgh and nearby Allegheny arrived late Monday and also helped pump water into Chicago water mains. Cincinnati sent 2 steamers. Miles Greenwood, a Cincinnati businessman, contacted his friend Christopher Ahrens to find out if he had any finished fire engines in his plant. The only one available was an experimental engine on display at the city's exposition center. They went straight there, took it off the floor, hitched it to a team of horses, and drove it to a rail yard. There they loaded it onto a special train Greenwood ordered as a director of the Cincinnati and Southern Railroad, which then ran to Chicago with Cincinnati engines and their crews and gave Ahrens the opportunity to try out his newest apparatus. Indianapolis, Louisville, and Janesville also responded to Chicago's crisis. So did Detroit, which sent 2 engines, hose carts, crews, and horses, and stopped their train along the way in Ypsilanti, Jackson, Niles, and New Buffalo to pick up additional men and equipment. Williams was thankful for the outpouring of help, with many of Chicago's engines close to or already breaking down, countless lengths of hose lost or damaged, and crews nearing collapse after days of almost nonstop work and little chance to rest. The foreign fire companies, as those from other municipalities were referred to, took up the fight to save Chicago wherever they were directed. The Ohio engines pumped 38 hours straight without incident, and Chris Ahrens himself worked at the controls of his experimental engine. Years later, motorized Ahrens pumpers became one of the most famous brands in America. Chicago had 57 of them, making up almost half its fleet in the 1920s. They were so durable they remained in service for decades. At about 11 p.m. on Monday, a steady rain started to fall. It wasn't that much, but to Williams, his men, and the other citizens of Chicago, it was like manna from heaven. Despite the rain, the fire spread all the way to the city limits at Fullerton, burning a total area about 4 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. Some 100,000 inhabitants, or about a third of the population, were burned out of their homes, and 17,500 buildings were lost, including many of the finest businesses in the city. The fire department itself was decimated. New York sent 3 engines to take the place of Chicago units while they underwent repairs or new ones could be brought in. Chicago's department also lost 6, or about a third of the houses of its 17 engine companies to the fire, which was basically out by dawn on Tuesday, October 10th. From the night of the first Saturday until the morning of the following Tuesday of October 1871, Chicago and its fire department endured a calamity that few large cities would ever again experience in peacetime. The rapid spread of the fire, worsened by dry weather and notorious winds, together with buildings made largely of wood, made it clear that the fire department needed to recover and expand quickly to serve the city adequately. As to how the fire was handled by the fire department and its resources, Fire Marshal Williams was devastated at seeing his adopted city taken down before reaching its prime, and knew that in the eyes of some, he would always bear some measure of responsibility. As he was reported to have said after testifying to a board of inquiry near the end of 1871, "I have given my testimony from the best of my recollection. My detractors grilled me like a Lake Michigan perch, but I gave it right back. I did my duty to the best of my ability with what I had at my disposal. Let history be the judge."